Hey everyone, so today we're going to do a quick little walkthrough on how to remove the stock shock on your Yeti bike and replace it with your brand new 11.6. Okay, so for the first part, we're going to take two 5mm hex keys to loosen up the front shock mount bolt. On the Yetis, they use an axle pin and bolt system. So once we loosen up the bolt, we can use that to kind of start the pushing the axle through. We'll remove the bolt and washer and just set those aside. For the next step, we're going to go to the rear of the shock, and using a 4mm hex key, we're going to loosen up the collet bolt. After we've removed that collet bolt, we can now access, with a 5mm hex key, the actual 5mm hex axle. Okay, so once you've completely loosened that rear axle, it's easy to grab a rag to give you a little bit more traction on the axle pin. You might want to lift up on the wheel just a little bit to help free up the tension. Be careful to remove that rear axle and slowly lay the shock down so that it doesn't damage your down tube or scratch it. Okay, with the rear axle removed, the shock is now free to remove the front axle and then simply slide the shock out of the frame. Okay, so your new 11.6 comes complete with everything you need to bolt it right into the bike. So now we're going to just follow those steps in reverse. So starting with the front shock mount, we're going to simply slide the shock into position and slide the axle pin, the front axle pin, through the front shock mount hardware. Okay, so now we're going to simply raise the rear of the shock up, start the axle pin, and again, lift up the wheel of the bike to help us get the guide pin or the axle all the way through the eyelet and into the upper link. Okay, so once we have the axle pin lined up, we're going to use our torque wrench and our 5mm hex key to tighten to the standard 15 Newton meters. Okay, so now that the rear axle is in and torqued properly, we're going to reinstall the collet bolt and torque it to the standard Yeti 8 Newton meters. Okay, so for the last step, we're simply going to take the bolt and washer that we removed earlier and reinstall that into the axle and torque to the standard 10 Newton meters. Okay, so now that the shock is completely installed and torqued, it's important to point out that the front shock mount runs on our spherical ball system. This allows the shock to move freely side to side, which is completely normal. This aids in small bump sensitivity, so any side loads that go into the shock can be easily taken up by the spherical bearing. And lastly, the shock is now ready to ride. All of the settings for low speed compression, high speed compression in both valves, as well as preload on the spring and your rebound adjustment have all been preset. You can refer to your settings card in your box to determine what these stock settings are, but there's no need to make any adjustments. Now it's just time to ride.